Moderna announcing its request for emergency use authorization from the FDA for its vaccine for children under 5 years age and as young as 6 months. The move, long awaited, could make vaccines available for millions of American kids by this summer. For more on all this, let's bring in ABC News medical contributor and emergency physician, Dr. Darien Sutton. Doctor, good to see you. So the American Academy of Pediatrics is calling for a quick review of COVID vaccines for the youngest Americans. How important is it that these little ones, 5 and younger, be vaccinated, given, what a lot of parents look at, that COVID is less serious for the little ones?
It's incredibly important, and I will say, and I agree with parents, that although it's less likely that a child will become severely ill secondary to a COVID infection, it doesn't mean that the risk is zero. We have the risk of long-haul COVID, which we can see approximately 30% of those who have had a prior infection can be vulnerable and at risk for. We also have these increased risk of complications like multisystem inflammatory syndrome and the increased risk of myocarditis in natural COVID infections compared to vaccinations. And then, of course, we're starting to see more research and data showing the possible associations to COVID-19 infections and something like type 1 diabetes, which is incredibly concerning.
Well, let me ask you, how would you advise parents to go about considering the question of whether to vaccinate a child between 6 months and 5-year-olds? Many are hesitant, of course. Moderna's is a low-dose vaccine, I understand. But as these vaccines come available, how do you advise parents of young ones?
I do a sit-down where I ask what is the concern specifically. I share the information that we have, and then I ask to confirm what other information is needed to make a formal decision. Right now, it's important to understand that although Moderna has requested authorization for its vaccine for those 6 and under, we have yet to see the full data sets, as they have up until May 9th, or expected to submit their final data collection. So up until that time, I'll be able to have a moment where I can look at the information and help parents who are concerned understand if it's beneficial for their child.
And doctor, in your practice, have you seen many children this age with COVID? How do they fare?
The common presentation of a child with COVID-19 is very much similar to that of the majority of the population, which are those who get infected, get cold-like illnesses, possibly a flu, cough. But unfortunately, those children who are more at risk, which are children living with obesity and children living with other chronic diseases such as diabetes, are at risk for not just hospitalization, but ICU admission and death. And although that risk, again, is small, it isn't zero. But I would have to say for the majority of those that I see, those children, fortunately, do okay. But only time will tell what effects the virus has in the long term.
Yeah, it has been, as I say, a small blessing in this pandemic that children, especially the youngest, seem to be spared from the worst of it. But based on what we know about Moderna's trial, Pfizer has this 3-shot vaccine. How do you compare those two?
It's a great question, and it's really difficult to compare. And I'm sure that the FDA and the CDC will have a moment where they'll have to sit down and understand what is beneficial. On one hand, you have parents and the American Academy of Pediatrics calling for swift approval of this vaccine. Of course, we have yet to see the full data. But on the other hand, you have the concern of a public health message, which might be confused among parents. You have one vaccine which is currently in wait to be possibly approved, that is 2 doses, and then Pfizer is currently working on their 3-dose vaccine. And although these vaccines work in similar ways, they have different mechanisms, they have different weights in the way that you give them. So I understand how that can be a concern when trying to relay a message to the public and avoid confusion. So I'm hopeful that when we get this information, the outcome will be a lot more clear.
And my hunch is if you polled 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds on whether they wanted 2 shots or 3 shots, you know what the answer would be there.
I think so. I think so. I think we all know the answer to that.
Let me pivot, Doctor, to China. These extraordinary scenes in China. Shanghai entering week 5 of a lockdown there. Cases continue to rise in some areas. What does that tell you about either how China has handled the pandemic so far with very rigorous measures, and that at some point, the dam is going to burst on that, or does it suggest something about the potential of the virus?
I think both are true. China is in relatively a precarious situation. Their prior long-term COVID protection in terms of lockdowns have protected them from prior surges that we have experienced here in the United States and protected them from unnecessary death. But they also have a second issue. They have a tremendous amount of vaccine hesitancy, specifically among those most at risk. Their elderly population in some provinces, only approximately 50% have been fully vaccinated over the age of 65, and they have one of the fastest growing elderly populations. And so I think those two combinations, that of low immunity from prior infection, also a highly transmissible Omicron variant, and the setting of low vaccine protection amongst those who are most vulnerable, and limited hospital capacity, puts China in a very high-risk situation. And it only tells us the story. You know, at the end of the day, this pandemic isn't completely over until all countries can share that moment.
And we are a long way from that still, as China's showing. Dr. Darien Sutton, thanks. Good to see you.
It's good to see you as well.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.